It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for taking time out to have a chat with us.
Sure, no problem.
I hope you can understand our accents okay. We'll try and talk, we'll try and talk nice and slow for you, all right? Slow,
Right?
slow as we can. Have you ever been to Scotland, Jesse? Have you ever heard much of the Scottish accent before?
Oh yeah, I've been there.
Yeah, you've been to Scotland. Did you come over to the UK a lot then for your DJing travels?
Yeah, I mean, I used to, obviously, not lately.
Yeah, no one's traveling right now, are they?
Right?
No one's traveling much right now, are they?
Not lately.
Where is it you're based now, Jesse? Are you LA? Did it say? Are you out in LA?
Yeah, I'm in LA.
Yeah. What you guys been up to out there before all this happened? Are you still pushing the book? Really, is that the focus right now? Pushing the new book?
Oh yeah, I mean, that's an ongoing thing. So
Yeah,
that's an everyday thing.
that's
I'm
taken
doing
up.
a weekly show now. It's in their own words live, where
Right.
we actually are spotlighting different cities and areas now,
All right.
and we'll do like panels and have everyone put together their ideas and share their ideas of how they've come to love house music and what it means to the city and the scene there and so on and so forth. So that's pretty cool. I actually do those on Sundays too, but we do those on Sunday evenings.
Nice one. Because there's been
Mm-hmm.
a lot of research put into this book. I think I've been reading through it, and there's just some great history going in there, some great contacts. How long has the book been in the making for? Has that been a long time coming then?
Oh yeah, I think I started collecting stories maybe 5 years ago, so
Right.
it's been a while.
What was the aim for the book, Jesse? Were you just trying to get to the root of where the disco transitioned over to house? What was the target or the aim for the book? Really, just to tell the stories.
um, yeah, again, same theme as the show that I do. Basically, your story of how you discovered house music, what it means to you, why you love it so much, and you know what it
Yep.
means to your life.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that was the whole premise of it, and
Yep.
just basically collecting stories from people in different places around the world to see how effective, or how close and similar the vibes are, no matter where you live.
Yep.
You pretty much found it the same way. Obviously, different circumstances and different people, but
Yeah.
how it's affected your life.
It must be great to have the book out there now after all the work that you've put into it over the last few years. Have you been getting like good feedback from it so far?
Oh yeah, we've got great feedback, great reviews, everything. I mean, it's inclusive, which is what I wanted. I wanted something that would be inclusive to everyone,
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
and not be about, the same, 10, 15, 20 people telling the same story about, how great a DJ they are or what records they made. I mean, I could care less about that. I've heard that story a million times, and
Mm-hmm.
everyone else has too. So I wanted this one to be about the underdog, the people
Mm-hmm.
who didn't get their voices heard, the people
Yeah.
who actually made the party and made house music what it is. It wasn't the DJs, it wasn't the producers or the artists, it was the people who listened to it. Because
Mm-hmm.
if they don't come to the parties and listen and whatnot, we have no scene.
Mm-hmm.
So
Definitely.
Jesse, could we maybe talk a little bit about your experiences right from the very start of the house music scene? Because obviously you were there right at the very birth of the whole scene. In fact, like you had the first house music record that was ever committed to vinyl. What kind of led up to all that? How did you get involved in the music back in the day?
yeah, well, music or the scene of what became house music. Because
A little bit of both,
musically,
but
I
how did you get
started.
into that music and then involved in that scene?
Yeah, because musically, I started a long, long, long time ago. I was I started taking musical lessons when I was about 5 years old, so that was all the way through.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother was a teacher and a pianist and singer herself, so that was all we did around the house, and
Right.
that just became kind of the whole hobby, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not even really more a hobby. It was really just more a way of life
Yep.
than anything. And so I was always pretty much musically inclined and understood music from a more technical standpoint as opposed to just a listenership, like most people, which means that I would break things down in a way or listen to a song in a way that others didn't.
Yeah.
So for me, it just became, as I got older, wanting to take that music and have it do things that I wanted it to do as opposed to what it would do just in the grooves, So I started taking a cassette deck with a pause button and more or less making different edits and cuts and adding parts and extending breaks and doing all kinds of stuff. What we know today is being edits and remixes.
Yeah.
Back then I had no idea what I was doing. I just knew that I wanted to do it and I could. So I did it. So, I would do all kinds of songs, from Get Off by Foxy to, One Nation Under Groove by Funkadelic and Aqua Boogie and Heat Wave, Groove Line and what's the other line? Boogie Nights. Boogie Nights was my favorite. I better.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I had all of these pause button remixes, and I had a boombox. I was like that kid in the neighborhood that walked around with the boombox, on my shoulder and everything, playing music for everyone. And, like the Pied Piper, they'd follow me around and
Party starter.
Be dancing and whatnot. And, I had various different organizations that my mother had me a part of growing up as a kid that, were meant to enhance and enrich your experience, your growing experience, and being around people that, were positive and upwardly mobile and, all that kind of stuff. So it was like I had all of these different kinds and types of people that I was able to play it when everyone reacted to it. So, that gave me right off the bat the opportunity to understand what made people dance and feel the music, move and groove and things like that. So by the time my stepbrother Wayne, who had been a DJ already, started hearing my remixes and whatnot, he thought to himself that this would be his opportunity to have something that nobody else had. And when he was DJing, and he, obviously he was right, because the crowds reacted, and now I have a bigger audience, and now it's become a thing where people are wondering how in the world, we get these versions, where they come from, where do you buy them, a whole 9 yards. And obviously they couldn't buy them, but, they could only get them at our party. So guess what? Everybody starts coming to our parties, and then the movement just kind of grows from there. And, by the time I got to the playground, which was the early 80s, I was playing for about 1,500 kids a night. And I was able to play all of my different things. By now, I pretty much incorporated a drum machine, and I was making segues through all the various tempos of things that were, from disco to, I was playing a lot of electronic hip hop, like Soul Sonic Force and Africa Bambaataa, and a lot of Italian imports, and just things that could go anywhere from 80 or 90 BPMs up to probably 150 or 160. So I needed a way to segue those things together, so there could be one continuous, cohesive dance experience. So I started making my tracks that would do that, where the tempos could change. And I started adding, especially with an 808, you got all the side sticks and the cowbells and the congas and all that. So it just became their own life at that point, So at that point, I just kind of, was in a record pool, which basically got me all the records free that were coming out. And, because here I am, I've got this captive audience because, back in those days, you didn't play for just an hour or two. I had to play from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. in the morning,
That's a shift. That is a
shift. That was a whole different thing.
Oh, yeah.
Which was great, actually, because, when you're doing that, you actually really get a chance to take people on a journey. You don't have to worry about how many records to get in before you get off and the next person comes on, and so on and so forth. So, I was able to, you also in those days, now you don't want to play a record twice. Back in those days, if the record was hot, we'd play it 3, 4, 5 times a night. Which is great because it broke records. It made people really see what the hot records are and the whole 9 yards. So, I just think it was just so much better back then because you just had the opportunity to actually be a real DJ and actually break music and actually understand the music and take people on journeys and whatnot. You can't do that in an hour. You know, I mean, try to get as many people as you can on in a 9 or 10 hour period is ridiculous to me. It's like, why not put the quality people in there with a couple of openers and at least let them have 2-3 hour sets, maybe 4 hour sets, you know?
Set the vibe.
Because if they're a good DJ, I mean, if you're talking about like myself or Steve Hurley or Mark Farina or Farley, it's like you want to hear what we have to play. You know, a lot of the times, not to say that the other DJs aren't that good, but there's some DJs that they stick in there that just aren't really taking you anywhere and not doing anything. They're just playing maybe the hits or, you know, some obscure stuff. And it's like, well, you could have saved that 4,000 or 5,000 pounds and, you know, and let us play longer because they didn't really do much. You know, I mean, I hate to say that nobody does anything because I think everyone is a DJ is creative in their own way. But if you really want to be technical about it, there are just a lot of points in a lineup where you see there's not much happening. So, you know,
I think when it was,
is what it is.
When it was the
Anyway,
record,
so playing that long at the playground, I was able to actually, you know, again, break records, take people on that journey, take them through the highs and the lows of everything and see and experience how they moved, why they moved. Because you had different cliques back then. You had the punkers, you had the preppies, you had, you know, the cool people, you had the nerds. It was just all people from all parts of town. In Chicago, that was the first time that this had really happened because the playground was centrally located.
Right.
It was actually close to downtown, whereas all the other things that we've been doing had mostly been far south and maybe some far north and maybe on the west side. Well, being centrally located, this brought everyone together. So 1,500 people, all different kinds of people, breaking great music to them, being able to display my tracks. It was obvious that at some point someone would ask what the heck I was doing. And I went to the record store where I was in the record pool and they asked me about some, you know, something I was playing that they didn't know what it was. And he's like, well, I give you all your music. It's got to be something I gave you. I was like, well, I have no idea what it was because I wasn't even thinking that my tracks would be something, you know, special that people were like, they were just a means to an end for me to make the experience night. So we found out that's what it was. And the guy, his name was Frank Sells. I never forget him. He goes, Jesse, you're playing something that people are asking for, and we have no idea what it is. He's like, I told him what it was. He's like, yeah, so if you could get your hands on some copies of that, some vinyl pressings of that, we could probably sell a few hundred of those, like right away. So right away, ding, light bulb goes over. Like, how do I make a record? So that's when I met Vince Lawrence. He was hanging around. He became my light man, and I would pick his brain all day about it. Because his father owned a record label. Mitch Ball.
Is that what it was? Is that what it was?
Yeah, his father owned Mitch Ball Records, which was a jazz label at the time, and blues and whatnot. But for his graduation from high school, his father gave him a recording session in a recording studio. So he was able to make what he wanted, what he thought was the music that he was listening to at the club that I was playing and whatnot. But it turned out being more of a new wave, faster vibe that really didn't fit. But because he was the only person that I ever knew that made a record, I was like, hey, we're going to break your record. So I would play it all the time and whatnot. But anyway, so I picked his brain, found out that there was a pressing plant in Chicago by the name of Precision Record Labs, where the infamous Larry Sherman worked. And
I've heard stories about Larry. I've heard stories about that.
So that was the beginning of this whole journey of how house music started. Was the moment I walked in that place, and you know, because back in those days they only had like bands that were playing. You had polka bands and blues bands or whatever, and they would press 45s, you know, a few hundred copies that they would give out during their shows and stuff like that. So here we come walking in there looking for 500 copies of a 12-inch, which at the time was considered like an album. Know, with like 10 songs on it and whatnot that people did. So I got looked at like, here come these two young teenage kids coming here asking to press, you know, some long play albums. And he doesn't do that. And he's like, well, what are you guys going to do with these? So we're young and naive, so we tell them everything. Oh, we do this at the playground. People go to this store, they go to imports, they buy records, and blah, 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 blah. So he's sitting there the whole time like, okay, let's see what they do. So that, and just like I picked Vince Lawrence's brain, he just pretty much watched us, and now we moved, and you know, and he just got in his own thing of like, okay, well, if I press all the records, every time somebody comes in here and presses one, I'll press some for myself, and I'll sell them, you know, under the table for half the price to everybody. So he started making a killing because now all these other Chicago producers and people are coming in there, and DJ International Records and all kinds of stuff are like basically, you know, pressing their records there. And then you have my label, and you had Ray Barney with which Dance Mania, which I came back, and so on and so forth. And it was just like everybody wanted to press records. So it was kind of hard to, you know, not control everything, which is what he did. I mean, he was so into it that when Michael Jackson had Thriller out, he was pressing his own versions of those and selling them. So he pretty much bootlegged anything he could get his hands on.
Yeah, I heard he was a bit shady like that.
It's a good album though.
You get the dodgy copies.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's how it was. You know,
I think did they not recycle the records, Jesse? Did they not repress them? Like, he would melt them down and repress other records?
What he would do instead of buying virgin vinyl, which is what you're supposed to do when you're making a new pressing, he would buy old record that didn't sell, that could have been sitting around for years, and he would just punch the hole out in the middle with the label, and then grind up the rest of it to make his own vinyl. So I mean, he probably saved himself, you know, 90 cents on a dollar, you know, when he's doing it that way.
But it's crazy to think little stories like that, what that went on to create house music as we know it today. It's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, everything has very rudimentary beginnings. You know, when a new genre is created or a new movement or style, it's not something when somebody just sits up and diabolically comes up with this great thing. Oh, we're going to create house music and it's going to take the world by storm and be massive. It's like, no. I mean, you think about it from like my standpoint. Once I got that first record pressed on and on, which was really, to me, it was a collection of my tracks and then just being silly on the A side, because it really, I didn't really take it seriously. But, you know, all of a sudden, because like I said, the B side was a side that was important. It had all the tracks on it. Those are the things that I was playing. Everyone knew that. The A side was just kind of like, okay, well, let's just have some fun. And then people start picking up on the A side and playing it. And I'm sitting there like, oh my God, no, it wasn't meant to be played, you know. So sitting there and making these first run of tracks, you know, the Dum Dums and the It's Okays and the Lanois, I Want to Dance and all that kind of stuff that I did was really more experimental, you know. I've never been one to really copy anything. On and On, to a degree, was more or less meant to copy something, was meant to copy that Mach 1 record that I had that got stolen, that I wanted to at least have my own version of, right? So that started out again, but it wasn't something that I took that serious. It was just something to do. So the next ones just became more experimental. It was like, okay, well, I have a sampler and I can do this and I can sample any sound I want. And I can change this and add that to it and whatever. So I just started taking different themes and different things and using them and just kind of throwing them in there and see what happens. So that's why you had this succession of tracks that came out On and On came out on Just Say, and then I did Funk You Up and Real Love and stuff like that. But we did more artist-oriented things on Just Say. I made the label Tracks. Larry and I came up with that name because I was doing all these tracks, and again, it wasn't meant to be like a frontline thing. It was meant to more or less kind of be an underground, you know, movement that DJs could play, DJ tools or different things to hype a party. Because you think about house music in those days, and well, I mean, even now, Chicago is known for its jacking, you know, high energy, up tempo type of sound, right? Whereas you think of a New York and places like that, they're a lot more laid back, more garagey feel kind of thing, whatnot, which is more or less an offshoot of disco for them. You know, even as I say in the book, you know, they try to
I'm going to hold that up right
They'll
now.
always try to say the house music came from, yeah, there it is. They'll say the house
Just get that
music
in there
came
for you,
from,
Jesse. Just plug that.
right? They'll try to say house music came
Available on
from
Amazon.
disco. Yeah, they'll try to say house music came from disco. And since disco is, I say disco is a native New Yorker, we'll give them that, even though that's really not even true, but they made it famous because disco actually came from Philly, from Philadelphia.
Yeah,
Gamble and Huff, and that the MFSB crew was the Earl Young being the father of the disco beat. So it really came from Philadelphia. But South Soul stole all the people from MFSB, took them to New York, and that's how disco became a thing. But okay, we'll give New York that. We'll say, okay, disco is a native New Yorker, but house is truly Chicago. And you know that in the form that how it started and what it became was really more or less the jacking part. It was all about dancing. It was you didn't come to look good. You didn't come to dress up. It wasn't about the flair. It wasn't about anything but coming in there and jacking your body.
Yeah, tell us about the jacking, Jesse. Tell us about the jacking, because I've heard kind of stories about the jacking in the warehouse. It can get a bit.
Well, let's define jacking first off. Jacking is the uncontrollable urge to move your body, grab things, and dance as hard as you can on anything you can find. So it's kind of like, I know, right? But it's like, I remember in, I think it was Pump Up the Volume, Chippy does an example in front of the old music box downtown. I thought it was really kind of funny because seeing him trying to jack was like the funniest thing in the world, because I've never in my entire life seen him jack anything. But that was hilarious. But that's pretty much what it is. And that was something that, like I said, in Chicago, you came to dance. You didn't come to look pretty. You brought another, maybe two shirts to wear because you were going to soak both of them. You brought towels. You brought your baby powder to put down on the floor so you could dance and you wouldn't slip and fall on your face and all of that kind of stuff. So it was always meant to be there to really like get into the music, and so hard and so well that it took control of your body and it made you, it's an uncontrollable urge basically.
Yeah.
Whereas when you think about other places, especially New York was never about jacking. New York was all about the hustle and looking pretty and what costume you were wearing. It was a whole different kind of vibe, So, for us, it's really, there'll always be a debate. Someone will always say, I did this and I was there and I was part of that and this movie. It's like, no, you had to actually have been there to lay claim to stuff. And that's the biggest problem I have. And one of the reasons why I wanted to dispel a lot of the myths, because I've been pretty much trying to do that for the last 30 years, because there've been so many published pieces of material, articles and things like that from DJ magazines and the Mix Mags and, all across the place on these artists that are basically out there to toot their own horn, which I don't blame you. Why would you not want to promote yourself? And why would you not want to make yourself big so you can get bigger bookings and make more money and people buy your records? Of course you want to do that. But the problem is with your propaganda and your embellishments, the truth of the history becomes jaded. It becomes blurred across the thing. And I've been trying to correct all of that for a long time because, if we don't have the proper history, same thing starts to happen, like happened with, what's the guy's name in rock and roll? Little Richard.
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah.
So where he was the catalyst and wrote a lot of those great songs that became hits for people, like the Elvises of the world and so on and so forth, but they got all the credit for it.
Yeah.
And it's like, my thing is like, let's tell the truth. You can still be who you are, but tell the truth. You cannot like not, sit out there and have people get diluted from what you're trying to do if you are telling things that don't gel with the story of how everything progresses.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
That's what's really important. Hang on a
second.
second.
I'm really enjoying the book because I guess another guest. No, that's why I'm really enjoying the book, Jesse, because it's getting to the facts. It just gets to the facts, and it even explores the origins of disco. Because you claim the Shaft theme, you claim as being the first disco track. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you reckon? All the research, you think that the Shaft theme was the first, what you would class as being the first disco record?
Well, I'll tell you how that came about was I had written the entire book and thought I was finished.
Yeah.
As I went back and read it the last time, it occurred to me that the evolution was not really complete. I mean, we can all simply say that disco, was the father that gave birth to house and moved forward. That story again has been told 1,000 times, right?
Yeah.
But I wasn't satisfied with that. So I was asking a lot of questions to people, especially people that might have been around in the disco era or had labels and things like that, or had DJ'd or whatever they were. And no one could definitively give me an answer as to where disco came from.
Yeah.
So it piqued my interest and I started doing more research and whatnot. And as I did the research, it kind of, the main portion of it would always start at Gamble and Huff.
Yeah.
With their MFSB orchestra, right? But then it also was something that, if you think about the first record that they can find where there was an MFSB crew and produced by Gamble and Huff type of record, was the OJs in 1969.
Yeah.
So I started looking at that initially as being, okay, well, maybe that was the inception. But then I actually had to go back a little further than that and think that, like, okay, well, where was that influence that started? So as I started looking at that, it made me go back into Motown. And then it made me go back into Sly and the Family Stone. And then it led me as far back as the Beatles.
Yeah.
And then I said, well, wouldn't this be something if the Beatles actually started disco? Right?
I wouldn't be surprised. That's a new book. That's a second book.
Right. So the quote, I have a quote in there from Paul McCartney where someone asked him, because they have a song that, in the mid 60s that sounds pretty much like a prototypical disco type of record. Yeah. And so I said, okay, I want to listen to this. So I listened to hundreds and hundreds of different songs and records just to see how close. And I was really amazed to find out how many actually had a similar type of backbeat and just the way they flowed, even the bass line, things like that, even though they didn't quite have all the elements that we've come to know what disco is. Some of them had some, others had others. And so listening to all these things, I just said to myself, well, let me look and see what else was going on there. So I had to go outside of that sound to even look and see, what the main sound, which a lot of it was that do do dat and dat and do do dat and dat and do kind of sound like, right? Which, if you really think about it, a lot of that without that snare hitting on the one, is actually kind of very disco, right? So anyway, make a long story short, I found a quote where someone asked Paul McCartney, where did he get that sound from? Because it definitely wasn't a UK thing or didn't come from London. He said, oh, that's definitely Motown. He's like, he just borrowed the Motown beat, basically, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So then I just started looking at Motown a lot more closely. Right? And as I looked at it, I know Norman Whitfield. Norman Whitfield was a good friend of mine, and his son Norman Jr. was my engineer for years. So I know, I worked with him. I worked with him on projects. I know how he works and what he's done. I mean, he did everything from Car Wash to Papa Was a Rolling Stone and all that great stuff, right? So for me, I really looked and studied his work, and what he was doing at the time was very, very innovative that no one else was really doing. Back then, they called it psychedelic soul, where it was very, very psychedelic, very underground type of, if you were on acid, you'd pick up those kind of sound type of thing, and it would really take you places. But he would put that funk underneath it and have the bass lines, and it would have like the cool syncopations and stuff. So I started to think, okay, well, maybe Norman Whitfield, had that vibe, because now what it starts to sound like is maybe Gamble and Huff got the vibe from Norman Whitfield. Right.
Yeah.
And then you had people like Isaac Hayes that were doing similar sound. But that's the one that really blew my mind, because Isaac Hayes did it as a sound that was a removed from everybody else. He wasn't in Detroit. He wasn't in Chicago, wasn't in Philadelphia, wasn't in New York. He was in the South somewhere, which I really like threw me. It's like, how in the world? Because, you know, unlike today where we have the internet and we have everything that we can hear things and people can share things, you couldn't do that back then. You know, no one knew. I didn't know what a guy was doing in Detroit, and they didn't know what I was doing in New York or whatever, right? So I was thinking to myself, how in the world did he? And maybe, just maybe, what happened was they had similar ideas of a sound and whatnot. And I found the same thing happen with myself and like Francois Kevorkian when we were doing like Pause Button Remix. It turns out he was doing a similar thing that I was doing in Chicago at around the same time too. So, you know, who knows how this thing happens? But to make a long story short, what I found was, although Norman had the feel and the groove almost there, Isaac Hayes actually took it there. It actually ended up with all the right elements and all the right sounds and all the right things when he did the theme from Shaft. So that's how I decided that was most likely the first disco record.
God, you've done your research, Jesse, haven't you? You have done your research.
Actually, like I said, I was done with the book when I started this, and it was a good 3 weeks, almost a month before I actually came to this conclusion.
Right.
So,
I have to plug this again, Jesse. If you're enjoying this conversation, guys, you have to get this book. You have to get this book. Brilliant. Absolutely.
What was it that inspired you to actually put this into like a book format, to like sit and do all the research and actually go ahead and make a book?
Well, I wrote my first book, House Music, The Real Story. But I did that 20 years ago. And I did that more as a tribute to my mom when she passed away, because she was obviously the nurturer, the catalyst, the financial, everything that made me who I am. Not just because she was my mother, but because she believed in my dream and what I was. She encouraged anything that I did creatively. You know, there was never you can't do that, or no, you have to go to school and get a job, or go to the army. There was never any of that. It was always indulging me in whatever whim I had. And consequently, it made me believe I could do anything. So I did, and I have my entire career. I just, whatever I feel like I want to do, I just do it. There's always, you know, the haters out there that'll say, oh, you can't do that. You can't. I was like, okay, well, watch me. And I do it. So I felt it was important that I made a tribute to her when she passed. So that was what that book was about. It was really more or less saying, thank you for giving me this path and this journey, you know, so far. And, you know, this is the only way I feel I can repay you, or even come close to giving a tribute to you as well. So when I wrote that, it was more a labor of love. And I did that myself. I said that I was going to have it finished by the January 1st of that next year. And I did. I locked myself in for 30 days and wrote the whole thing. But again, you know, I've had creative writing classes and whatnot, but I never considered myself a writer. Again, I did it just because I wanted to do it, you know, as a tribute. So I self-published it originally, and I was surprised. People bought it. I was like, wow, this is cool. So now I'm in the book publishing game, right? So in the 80s, I started record, you know, house music record production. In the 90s, I started house music books. That was interesting. So anyway, as I go through that, and again, I didn't put a lot of, you know, credence in the whole thing. It was just really more for me, you know, to say I did it. And if people wanted to read it, then they would find it and, you know, they'd buy it or whatever. And that would be that. Well, about 2006, I read a book, or I eventually read it, but I think at the time I saw it and started reading reviews on it, actually, by a guy by the name of James Cummins from Canada. And he was writing like a history of house music, but really dance music more than anything. And after reading, I reached out to him, and I was talking to him and telling him about, no, I know what it was. He reached out to me. He reached out to me to interview me for his book. That's what it was. And I started talking about the book that I wrote, and saying that, you know, a lot has changed in these last 6-7 years. I'd like to, you know, rewrite it would you be interested in working with me on it? And he said, sure. So we started working on it. And then later that year, it was actually, we got a publisher, and it was released as the second edition. Mm-hmm. And so that actually, you know, that got out there and did pretty well. And then later on, maybe about 7 years or so later, I said, well, I could do another book. And I thought to myself, well, I don't want to write a book, like sit there and have to write it. Yeah. What would be really cool is if I could just gather stories from people, like their own stories of how they found it and why it's so important to them. So I just started asking random people, friends, everybody, like, what's your journey? What's this and that? And, you know, I probably asked 1,000 people, and I got about maybe 300 stories. Of those 300 stories, a lot of them were kind of bits and pieces of things, you know, because the average person's not a writer. And most people write the way that they speak.
Yeah, notice that.
You know, so there's a lot of ands and likes and, you know, all this other stuff in there, run-on sentences and everything. So I found the ones that were most interesting. I pulled those out of there and, you know, had to fix them up a little bit, doctor them, put them together, make them cohesive so they actually told the story. So in essence, what I thought was going to be an easy journey in this book by using other people's stories turned out to be probably twice as hard as writing a real book, because at the end of the day, I had to do everything. Yeah. And not only did I have to do everything in it, but I had to make it cohesive. Yeah. So coming together as a book was the hardest part. And I don't think, probably if this quarantine didn't happen, this book never would have been, I won't say never, but it would have been a long time before I finished it. Because what it gave me was the time to actually sit there and spend and think about it and talk to, you know, some other writers and things like that, just to pick their brain on what they thought might be a good path, you know, to lead this book. And at the end of the day, I ended up almost doing the opposite of what they told me to do anyway, which is normal for me. So, but it struck me just like that same time when the guy Frank Sells at Imports told me if I could get my hands on some records, they could sell them. Well, that same kind of revelation hit me with the book. It's just like, I know exactly what to do. So that's the path that I took. And this time I decided I wanted to publish it myself because, you know, now we have the tools to do everything. You know? Especially with an Amazon and all these places. I was like, okay, I'm not going to settle for a small pittance of a royalty on a book again. I'm going to control my own, right? I'm going to control my own destiny on this one, how it's promoted and how it gets marketed and everything. And it was the best thing I could have ever done, because this time around is 10 times better than what I had with a publisher. Right. You know, it's been amazing.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting just to see it from that perspective of other people, because that really is getting to the core of the beginnings of just what inspired them and where it all began, really. When you hear it from somebody else's mouth, it really makes a huge difference, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, the whole premise of that was to tell the story from the people's perspective, as opposed to a writer trying to tell you what they want you to know or read, you know. You know, writers are great, but, you know, at the end of the day, the biggest problem with the writer is at some point, either they or their publisher has an agenda and they're trying to reach a quota. They're not really, in essence, trying to tell your story. They want to get it out there, but what they're doing is satisfying their own quota to either sell more magazines or advertising or whatever the case may be. So me being unbiased is kind of like, okay, well, I'm going to be the judge and the jury and the regulator on this. And what people say is their story will be their story, period. Unedited, uncut. That's just the way it is. The only thing that I did in there was some grammatical, you know, changes just to make it flow better. But the hardest part was going through all those stories and trying to figure out at what part or chapter this story should fit in. You know, because even though they're people's personal journeys, it's still a book and it still has to be cohesive and have a journey and a story.
Yeah, because I like the way you say, oh, it'll continue on this chapter, the rest of this part will continue, because obviously they're telling their story in a few paragraphs, really. But I like that.
Yeah, because I felt that especially people like Frankie Annabelle, who's in Las Vegas, started in New York as a disco DJ in the clubs, came and brought it. He's basically the godfather of house music and disco in Las Vegas, right? He started Studio 54 there. So if you didn't think he was, then there's your stamp for approval with Studio 54 in Las Vegas, because he brought it from New York, right? The concept. So his story starts with him very young in New York in the disco days, and then his family moves to Las Vegas. So
that's right.
I had to separate what was New York and create, because most of the story and most of his experiences happen in Vegas. So it didn't make sense to put it all in a New York chapter. So that's why I separated. There were a few people that were like that moved from one place to another, or started a particular scene in, you know, a different city. So it was important to show that the movement. Because there's a chapter in there called The Movement. Chapter 5 is actually called The Movement, of how it moved from out of Chicago and the Midwest into other places and other cities. So keeping that in a cohesive form, I wanted to make sure that the stories continue where they were supposed to.
Yeah. No, it's definitely worth a purchase. I can't advise it anymore. It's definitely worth grab. We could talk to you all day, Jesse, about the roots of disco in Chicago House, couldn't we, John?
Definitely.
We don't want to keep you too long. We don't want to keep too much more of your time, Jesse. But it's been an absolute pleasure.
Can I just ask something else, Jesse, just before we go? Because obviously you've been there since like the start of the whole scene, seen it all, the birth of the whole scene, and seen the evolution of. You spoke to so many different people about all their individual journeys throughout as well. What do you think's next for house music? How do you think it stands today compared to where it came from and where it's going now?
Well, you know, I get asked this question all the time. And the one thing that I've seen throughout all these years, I've seen so many different genres and subgenres develop from house music. You know, a lot of people don't like to describe house as EDM, which EDM is electronic dance music. So house is very much electronic dance music, you know, and you have to really understand how the term is defined, and you can't think of it from a personal perspective as how you feel about EDM, whether it's just noises and it sounds, and same thing they say about techno. There's some great techno out there, just like there's some bad house music. I mean, everything that you make, there's gonna be some good stuff and some bad stuff.
Yeah.
Just kind of the nature of the beast. I always say that the best and worst thing to happen to electronic music in general was the fact that we have taken it to a digital format in the form of a computer and a program. That's the best thing, because it allows you, you know, people to be able to be creative. But it's also the worst thing, because it allows everybody to be creative, and everybody shouldn't try to make music, because everybody is not musically inclined. You know, I mean, if you want to do it as a hobby, great, be my guest. But professionally, you don't need to be putting your stuff on you know, Apple Music and Track Source and Beatport. We don't need to hear your experiments at home on that. All it does is clog up the airways and the, you know, the sound for the people who are really making great music. And it's harder to find the great music because of it, you know? So, I mean, I can go on and on about that, but I think as far as like where house music is, it'll continue to do exactly what it's done for the last 40 years. It will evolve, and it'll come right back around. Because if you notice, every say 7 to 10 years, house music's a thing again. You know, something else will come up and dominate for a few years, and then it's right back to house music again. And what I think that is, and is what makes it special, is the fact that when you're young and you're experimental and you're rebellious and whatnot, you want those rebel sounds. You want those things that are different and crazy, and, you know, especially something that adults aren't going to want because you don't want to have anything to do with where the adults are. It's like, it's so funny, like kids are all on Snapchat and they aren't on Facebook because their parents are on Facebook, so they don't want to be on that. But it's the same type of thing. So, but as they mature and as they start to come to understand the music and the vibe and what it's really about, they end right back up in house music. So it's going to be the same thing. I mean, all house music is, to a great degree, are a lot of the elements that preceded it, which the foundation obviously is disco, but disco came from R&B and funk. House music borrows everything. It's got jazz, it's got blues, it's got reggae, it's got rock, it's got whatever you want to put in it. So having a musical genre that encompasses everything else will always be here. It's not going anywhere.
I think that's a good point. That's a good point to end on, I think, right there, Jesse. Great. It's been great chatting to you. And I'll just give the book another last plug just before we go. All right, guys, go and get this book. Unreal.
In their own words.
And it's not in
Yeah,
Jesse's words. It's in their own words.
That title came to me one day, and I thought about it. I was like, what is this? Because I had no idea what I was going to call it, right? And one day it just hit me. It's like, this is in their own words. So let's just keep the flow of that, because that says everything right there. You know.
Definitely.
No, thanks again, Jesse. Hopefully we'll get you on again in the future. It's been an absolute pleasure, my friend.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
Thanks
Got me
a lot,
up
Jesse.
earlier. I actually was out all night last night, so I actually woke up at 10:01 my time. I said, oh, did I miss? Because actually yesterday, I don't know, maybe I had a dream that I was supposed to be on or something.
Yeah.
And I woke up and it was like 11 something here. And I was like, oh my God, did I miss the show? So I actually like messaged you and everything. It's like, hey, I'm sorry.
just me and John sat here on our own talking.
I'm just not an early person. I don't do early.
Well, you take care, Jesse. I'm sure we'll chat to you again soon, my friend. All right.
Sure, of course. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jesse.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe over there.
You too.